Most people think home affordability is about whether the bank says yes. I have never trusted that standard. The bank is not asking whether the house will improve your life. The bank is asking whether it can keep you inside a payment long enough to make the loan profitable. Those are two very different questions, and confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes an ordinary family can make. That is why I want to tell you something directly. In 2026, a $500,000 house is not a middle-class home for most Americans. It is a stress machine with a front door. That is the mother line for this entire conversation, a stress machine, because the real problem is not just the sticker price. The real problem is everything that price attaches to once you sign: the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the PMI, the repairs, the lost flexibility, the job dependency, the quiet fear that every broken appliance now has the power to rearrange your month. People think they are buying a house too often. They are buying a 30-year claim on their own peace. And if you do not understand that, you can walk into homeownership believing you have reached a milestone when in truth you have simply volunteered for a more respectable version of financial anxiety. I want to begin with a lie that holds the entire structure together. Approval is not affordability. It is astonishing how many intelligent people still confuse those two words. A mortgage broker runs your debt-to-income ratio, plugs a few numbers into a system, and announces that you qualify. Suddenly, everyone around you starts talking as if the math has been solved. The house is within range. The dream is realistic. The conversation shifts from whether the purchase makes sense to how soon you can move in. That is where the trap closes, because qualification is a lender's risk standard. Affordability is a life standard. The lender asks, can this borrower probably keep paying? I ask, can this household still breathe after paying? That second question is the only one that matters, if you actually intend to live inside the life you are buying. A $500,000 house in 2026 sounds almost ordinary now, which is part of the danger. The price has been repeated so often that the public has stopped hearing how violent it really is relative to income. In dozens of markets, this number is now attached to houses that are not luxurious, not rare, not architecturally special, not dream homes in the old sense, a modest 3-bedroom, a tired kitchen, a small patch of yard, a house your parents would have called normal. But the financing attached to that normal house is no longer normal at all. That is why the first mechanism matters so much. I call it the down payment cliff. People like saying, just save 20%, as though that were practical advice instead of a detached performance. 20% on $500,000 is $100,000. That is not a budgeting tweak. That is a separate mountain. Most households do not merely need discipline to reach it. They need years of unusually good circumstances. Unusually low expenses, family help, exceptional incomes, or a level of sacrifice that often delays other parts of life while housing keeps moving away from them anyway. So what happens? They step around the cliff, 5% down, 10% down. They do what almost everyone else does. Because the market quietly teaches people that if the first door is locked, take the narrower door and hope it leads to the same place. It does not. The smaller down payment is not just a smaller down payment, it is the beginning of punishment layered onto the loan. That brings us to the second mechanism. I call it the poverty premium. PMI sounds technical and harmless, which is perfect for the people collecting it. But stripped of polite language, it is simple. You do not have enough money to protect the bank the way the bank prefers. So now you will pay extra every month for insurance that protects the bank from you. Not you from loss, the bank from you. That is an ugly little truth in the housing system. The poorer buyer does not just enter with less cash. He enters with extra monthly drag precisely because he is less wealthy. That is why a smaller down payment is not simply a bridge to ownership. It is often a doorway into a more fragile ownership experience from day one. Now we arrive at the payment itself. People hear the principal and interest estimate and assume they understand the burden. They do not. A mortgage payment in isolation is one of the most misleading numbers in personal finance because it is the cleanest part of the mess. The real house payment is the payment stack: principal, interest, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, PMI if you put down less than 20%. And then the uninvited guests who always arrive later: the HVAC unit, the roof, the water heater, the tree root in the sewer line, the leak behind the wall, the HOA special assessment, the deductible after a storm, the repaint, the appliance that dies on a holiday weekend. That is the stack. And it matters because a house has a unique talent for producing costs that are both necessary and badly timed. A broken refrigerator is not a philosophical problem. It is a deadline. A roof leak is not a budgeting concept. It is a demand. Houses convert ordinary life into capital calls with remarkable efficiency. This is why the 1% rule for maintenance exists. Not because every house will break on schedule, but because enough will break unpredictably that the owner who does not provision for repairs is not being optimistic. He is being naive. So by the time you add the actual payment stack together, the number gets far more serious than people want to admit. And then I ask the question nobody in the transaction is paid to ask, what does this do to the rest of your life? Because a house does not merely consume money. It rearranges behavior. That is the third mechanism. I call it the margin collapse. A household making what sounds like good money can still buy a house that destroys its financial margin. They make the payment. Fine, they keep the lights on. Fine, they still have groceries. Fine. And because nothing immediately explodes, they tell themselves it works. But it works is one of the most dangerous phrases in finance. Does it work if you cannot build an emergency fund? Does it work if retirement contributions turn symbolic? Does it work if every car repair goes on a credit card? Does it work if a job loss becomes an instant crisis? Does it work if the answer to every child's new expense is quiet panic? Does it work if you feel trapped in your job because the mortgage turned courage into a luxury? That is not working. That is surviving under an expensive roof. And survival dressed up as achievement is one of the cruelest illusions in the modern housing market. This is why I say the real cost of an overpriced house is not just monetary. It is strategic. It narrows your options. It reduces your ability to take risk. It ties your emotional stability to the uninterrupted arrival of income. It turns a bad boss into a bigger threat. It turns a recession into a personal emergency. It turns every career decision into a mortgage decision. That is not ownership in the elevated sense people talk about. That is indenture with granite countertops. Now, I want to talk about a household that many people would describe as comfortable, 2 solid incomes, good jobs, responsible people. They are not reckless. They are not living extravagantly. They are exactly the kind of household everyone assumes should be able to handle a $500,000 house. And then the arithmetic starts. Taxes take a large bite before the paycheck ever arrives. The mortgage stack shows up. The cars still need to be insured and fueled. Student loans still exist. Health insurance still costs real money. Food still costs more than it did. Utilities in a larger house are not symbolic. Now, what is left? Enough to live, perhaps enough to save aggressively, absorb shocks, and build wealth with confidence. Often no. That distinction is everything. Because the market has normalized a kind of misery that would have looked obviously reckless a generation ago. We now call people house poor, as if it were a cute and inevitable phase of adulthood, rather than a sign that the numbers were wrong from the beginning. I do not like euphemisms that make financial injuries sound normal. If a purchase strips you of sleep, flexibility, and savings capacity, it is not a milestone. It is a misallocation, however socially approved it may appear. This is where culture becomes part of the trap. Homeownership is still marketed as maturity, stability, adulthood, success, responsibility, even virtue. People are told that renting is throwing money away, that buying is how adults build wealth, that if they do not buy now, they will be priced out forever, that the pain is temporary, that everyone stretches a little, that equity makes the stress worthwhile. Some of that is true in the right context. A house can be a wonderful long-term asset. A house can stabilize life. A house can allow equity to accumulate. A house can be a great decision, but only if the owner survives the payment stack with enough margin left to be a person. That is the standard most public conversations refuse to apply. They speak as if ownership is always superior by default. It is not. A house you can barely afford is not a wealth strategy. It is a hostage negotiation with your own future. And I want to say something especially for people who feel ashamed that a $500,000 house seems impossible. The shame does not belong to you. It belongs to the mismatch. Home prices have outrun income so badly in many markets that what used to be a reasonable aspiration has become a luxury item disguised as normal. The listing photos still look like middle-class life, so people keep thinking the numbers must somehow work if they just squint hard enough. They do not. Not for most households, and pretending otherwise does not create affordability. It simply creates more overextended buyers and more people trapped in homes they cannot actually enjoy. That is why I think the most important word in this entire discussion is not equity. It is margin. Real wealth requires margin, margin to save, margin to invest, margin to repair, margin to leave a bad job, margin to handle life, margin to think clearly. A house that destroys your margin may still build equity on paper, yes, but paper equity is not freedom if every month of your life feels like a balancing act performed for the bank. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the American dream inversion. The house was supposed to create security. Instead, for millions, it creates fragility. The house was supposed to be the foundation. Instead, it becomes the pressure point. The house was supposed to make adulthood feel more stable. Instead, it makes the household more sensitive to every shock. That inversion is one of the clearest signs that the market is no longer pricing homes for ordinary life. It is pricing them for buyers willing to absorb abnormal stress and call it normal. I refuse to call that normal. So what would I do if I were staring at a $500,000 listing today? First, I would stop looking at approval and start looking at post-closing life. Not can I get the loan, can I still fund retirement, emergencies, repairs, and ordinary joy after the loan. Second, I would calculate the full payment stack, not just the mortgage teaser number. Third, I would stress test the income. What happens if one spouse loses hours? What happens if insurance jumps? What happens if repairs hit in bunches? What happens if taxes rise faster than expected? Fourth, I would ask whether the house increases or decreases my margin. If it decreases it severely, then no amount of social approval can make it a wise purchase. Fifth, I would remember that there is no trophy for becoming house poor. There is no medal for being approved. There is no hidden virtue in spending the next decade white-knuckling your way through ownership while calling it success. And if the answer is that the math simply does not work, then I would walk away without embarrassment. That may be the hardest part because people fear what walking away means. They think it means failure, delay, inferiority, adulthood postponed. It means none of those things. Sometimes walking away means you were the first honest person in the room. The bank was not honest. The agent was not honest. The culture certainly was not honest. That counts for a great deal, because sometimes the smartest financial move is not finding a way to participate in collective insanity. It is refusing to let collective insanity become your personal balance sheet. I have always believed that real wealth is not a house. It is the ability to live without constant financial fear. If a house helps you build that, wonderful. If a house destroys that, then the roof is not worth it. That is the test. Not whether the market says this is normal. Not whether your friends say everyone stretches. Not whether a broker says you qualify. Whether the life inside the house will still belong to you after the payment stack arrives. That is the only honest standard. And for most households looking at a $500,000 house in 2026, the math is saying something painful but useful. This is not a starter home. It is a stress machine. And sometimes the smartest way to win is to stop letting other people call a trap an opportunity.